Hello, I am Dairton Bass, I'm founder of Agile Trends, and I would like to share something with you. Besides the majority of the people attending the event came from Spain, we had registrations from a total of 43 countries worldwide. It's a huge victory. Thank you guys, all the people, all the company who supported us to spread this mastery, because we are very happy with this result and this victory, because we did we are having a major event today. And now I would like to start the next session. In 2020, two things happened. On one side, COVID changed all the plans we had for this year. In the other, in this new scenario, Agile moved from a nice to have approach to a fundamental requirement for success. And in the other hand, Scrum Turns 25. What leads a reflection? Is the current Agile the same as Scrum was defined 25 years ago? To answer this question, I would like to invite our special guest, Dave West, CEO from Scrum.org, to share his thoughts about this very challenging moment we are living and what he believes companies and teams will face in the near future. Dave, are you there?
I am. Hello, thank you.
Thank you very much to be with us.
Let me just share my screen if that's okay. Hello, everybody. My name's Dave. Thank you for that fabulous introduction. I love the phrase, Agile has turned from a nice to have to a fundamental. And I think that that is something that we've all seen this year. So I've got a few slides to share with you today. I'm speaking to you from just outside Boston, Massachusetts, United States of America. Normally I would be in the office, but that doesn't really happen. Interestingly, our office in Burlington, Mass was where arguably the first or second, depending on who you ask, Scrum project ever happened. The argument, whether it was the first or second, is this definitely was the first where it was called Scrum. However, if it's not called Scrum, is it still Scrum? That's an interesting question. So you know who I am. I run Scrum.org for a gentleman there called Ken Schwaber. Ken Schwaber is one of the creators, along with Jeff Sutherland, of Scrum, a signatory of the Agile Manifesto, creator of the Agile Alliance, then Scrum Alliance, and now Scrum.org. You know that we do training. You know that we do certification. Over the last few months, we've gone from training about 7,000 people a month to nearer 3 with live virtual classes, and about 1.2, 1.3 million people come to our website every month, which is incredible and really talks to and speaks to the importance of Scrum and the importance of an agile mindset. I think I don't need to say this, it was said in my introduction. I think COVID-19 has reminded us why agility is so important. If I was here last year, if we were speaking in 2019, maybe I'd be in person, who knows, but I'd also be talking about why the world is in these cycles of change. I don't think we need to do that now. I think ultimately the reality today is that we're in cycles of change. And that really has been predicted by people. And this is just one book that's predicted these sort of things. Thomas Friedman is an author that I like. He wrote The World is Flat. Some of you may have read that, or That Used to Be Us, which is a really interesting book about the future of education. His latest book is called Thank You for Being Late, which really talks in detail about, he calls it the supernova, all these pressures of globalization, Mother Nature, and technology all coming together at a moment in time, which is changing the very fabric of the world that we live in. Interesting, talking about globalization. The second day of our lockdown in March, so we locked down in Massachusetts about March 15th, and my last day in the office was March 13th. And the second day, so middle of that week, my son broke his Nintendo Switch. Timing. I still haven't got a replacement Nintendo Switch, because ultimately the world we live in today is incredibly connected, incredibly complex. Global supply chain coupled with, you know, the environment and obviously COVID-19, and then this application of technology is changing everything as well. Particularly if you look at the S&P 500 at the moment, you'll see that technology first companies are performing much better than others. Now, if I was a betting man, I would say that we are moving from one age to another. Now, that's been written about several times and in a lot of detail. A particular author that I like is Khalida Perez. She is Venezuelan. She'd be doing this presentation in Spanish, so I'm sorry she's not here, because she's awesome as well. She writes about these technology ages, and she's written in her latest book around technology revolutions of financial capital about the movement from what she describes of the age of oil and mass production. I sort of paraphrase that as the industrial age or the mass production age, into this digital age, this software and digital age. So it's time for a new normal. Now, usually there's pivots or tipping points that move from one age to sort of like the deployment period of the next age. And the tipping point that she would argue we're in is COVID-19. It will change us as a world to be a digital world, to be that next thing. The reason why I'm talking about this in the context of Scrum is because that means something quite different to the way in which historically we worked. When you look at the industrial age, what you see clearly is you see short-term profit, long-term planning, efficiency based out of a mindset of scarcity, specialization of labor. You get really good at doing one thing and you do it really well. Process and systems are king, driven by a manager. Now, that's incredibly different to this digital age. Short-term planning horizons. Imagine, I don't know if your boss is telling you today, we need to plan for the next 18 months. If he is or she is doing that, you need to take him or her to a bar and get him or her very drunk. I guess you can't go to bars now. Buy lots of large bottles and give it to them, because there's no way we can plan for 18 months. We have to do short-term, 3-month max planning horizons, and be rapidly evaluating how successful our hypothesis or plan was, and in context of reality. So we need to focus, instead of focusing very clearly on immediate gratification and profit, we need to really have a mission and impact in mind. You know, in Scrum, we talk a lot about goals. Maybe in the next release of the Scrum Guide, that'll even be better. But we talk a lot about goals and the idea that you really focus on the goals, and your product backlog should ultimately talk about outcomes, not work. And then your sprint backlog will talk about the work to deliver on those outcomes. Because what we try to empower and enable is teams to focus on missions, because we know that gives the best results. So the next thing is about, obviously, innovation, because we live in an abundant world. My website is supported on AWS. It's got millions of people coming to it, and it costs a little bit more than $1,500 a month. And it's awesome, and it works everywhere. Isn't that incredible? You can do anything. You know, there's a great example of COVID-19 testing. The Broad Institute is a big Scrum shop. They map the human genome, if you know, that's sort of what their claim to fame is. And it's in Cambridge. They set up a COVID testing lab in 5 days using Scrum. How cool is that? Because they knew that they could do it. Cross-functional teams, self-organization, and the rise of the creator. The managers are at best facilitators, enablers, coaches, mentors. They're no longer telling people what to do. They, in terms of the product and the outcomes, they're setting direction and providing vision, and then basically building a support network to allow self-organized teams of creators to get on with it focused on that mission. Now, funny, if I look at that, doesn't that remind you of anything? Does that remind you of Scrum? Oh, maybe. I think that one of the reasons why Scrum is being so successful today and so popular, and Agile in general, is because ultimately we built a process for this new world. And the reason why we did that was because we were building software, and software was already in this new world. Now, I think the biggest change that we see is that we're changing that to that. So we historically have always said, when I talked to Ken about what motivated him was actually delivering working software, and he was having a hard time doing it. But then it became this pursuit of the waterfall, to kill the waterfall. Winston Royce wrote about the waterfall 50 years ago, interestingly. And 50 years ago, he wrote, this is a way you can organize, etc. Now, we've historically been fighting against the waterfall, but now we no longer are. What we're fighting against is actually the industrial mindset. As much as we appreciate we moving from one age to another, with still our education, our experiences, our parents' experiences are based on the industrial mass production mindset. So we really, really have to move away from that. And that's currently what we're fighting. Because the reality of the world that we did live in was on the left-hand side of this chart. You basically had a large amount of unknown when you were building a new product. You rapidly made lots of decisions, focused and delivered that, and then scaled it in a very known, structured way and became more and more efficient. What we live in today is a bit more like this idea of change is happening continuously, and we build a system that's in a process that continuously evaluates the environment it's in and then adapts to that environment in the most rapid way. Depending on the frequency of the change, depending on how unknown it is, determines the length of that review cycle. Determines the length in Scrum of the sprint, right? Now, what we've seen is that most organizations work to a 2-week sprint, though interestingly in the COVID world, we've seen a significant number of organizations move to a 1-week sprint, because the amount of unknown is a lot higher. Therefore, they like to do the cycle, Monday through Friday, really. And then they focus on that, and it gives them some clarity and structure through those 5 days. Now, we've seen these two models, the Stacy chart and the Kneffin model, both awesome ways of at least approaching thinking about this kind of work. We understand the importance of empirical process replacing a defined process control. Now, what's interesting is that doesn't mean we don't have simple work or even simple, complicated work. We still do. However, the majority of the work that we focus on, that knowledge teams focus on, that creators focus on, lives more in the complex, complicated life. And some would argue at the moment with COVID, we live in the chaotic. And I must admit that I'm finding my inability to plan, my inability to think ahead longer than a very small horizon, very, very stressful. I don't know whether my kids, my son is just in the other room on distance learning. My other son has actually gone into school today. I don't know whether Harry, my youngest, will still be in school tomorrow. Which makes it very tricky to plan and puts a lot of pressure on me. Also makes my wife grumpy, which makes me very grumpy. So we all know that Scrum, successful framework, we all get that. You've seen this diagram. And somebody said when I showed this diagram, why is the increment after the sprint review? Shouldn't it be before? Yes. That increment implies that everything builds this increment. Actually, I think the increment, because the increment's the thing that you review. So technically, I would like to see that in the before. So I'm going to try to change this diagram, which will cause some sort of major impact in our organization. I don't know why it's like that. And it's been like that for for 25 years, which is embarrassing. Hey? So we know all of this about 25 years. It's actually in October, so it's 24. And I remember when I was 24, I pretended to be 24 for a long time, you know. So we're actually 24 going on 25. October will become 19th, I think, October the 19th, 25. You know that 500,000 people have been trained on Scrum. We have about over 100 Scrum books with Scrum in the title alone on Amazon, and we know the Scrum guide's available. It's translated into I think 40 something languages. It was interesting. I think you said there's people from 40 countries here. I think we're 50 something languages now, the Scrum guide. We know the basics of Scrum. You know, Scrum is basically 3 very simple ideas. It is empirical process, self-management, empowered teams, and continuous improvement. Simple as that. However, and this is where I really want to talk about the future of agility, the things that we're seeing, and I'm going to zoom through this because I know time is pressing, but the things that we're seeing that really change Scrum from being this empirical, team-centric process, self-managed, empowered teams, really takes that power and exploits it in a scaled way, is when we call it professionalism. You could call it whatever you want. I don't really care what it's called, but where you add 4 things to it, where you add this concept or this social contract almost that defines a set of values and behaviors that create an environment for it to succeed, where you add discipline. So done means done, that you come to the events, you prepare, you update the card, you focus on doing the things that you commit to doing. You're very disciplined in your execution. When you focus it on the outcomes that are associated with a customer and a mission, it changes from being a work development thing to being a value development thing. And when you use this and your skills and you help others use it, then fundamentally the entire environment changes. So I'm going to talk about those 4 things because I think this is the future. I think organizations will adopt these ideas, or increasingly adopting the ideas. And I'm going to show you some proof points to this. So values. 2017, they're added to the Scrum Guide. Now, you could argue the Scrum Guide should not include values because they're contextual. And there was a lot of debate between Jeff and Ken. I'd actually just joined Scrum.org in 2015 when this debate was raging, and I sort of came in and using my usual charm, British charm, I like to think of it, though some would argue whether it's that. I talked to Jeff and Ken, and we talked about, you know, the importance of the values, and ultimately both of them agreed that you cannot be successful at all with Scrum and the framework unless you take these values really to heart. You know, the idea of courage. Now, courage doesn't just mean being arrogant and saying exactly what you feel. It's actually it's about being willing to challenge yourself and your ideas. A lot of people misuse courage to really have a go at people. And when people say, I don't like being treated like this, they say, oh, you're not being courageous. No, courage is about, though, facing up to the realities of not delivering stuff and not understanding stuff and needing help, etc., and being very, very transparent about that. Focusing on work is crucial to delivering value. Commitment, we get committing to the process. This is a discipline thing, respect and openness. Now, what's interesting is when we did a study with McKinsey 2 years ago, about 18 months ago, actually, and we were looking at the personality, the agile personality. Is there a certain personality that lends itself to agility? And McKinsey said, we don't want to talk just about Scrum, so we want to approach it in an agnostic way. And we found over and over again that there's a certain set of behaviors that create transparency, that create an environment of trust, that allow Agile to succeed. And we weren't alone in doing that. What we realized, actually, there was a study by Google called Project Aristotle, where they looked at all their high performance teams, and they found that the behaviors and values were shared across those teams. And those values lent themselves to psychological safety and creating an environment for success. So basically, I see the future around agility as we pivot out of COVID into this digital age, where the values and behaviors of every organization, every environment that agility is succeeding in, are really questioned. Are they creating psychological safety? Do we facilitate focus? Do we, all of those things that maybe it's the Scrum values. I would obviously encourage you to think about those, but some of those values might be your own. And how do you make them successful? Another way of describing that is culture, right? So creating that open and transparent culture. The next thing on the list is discipline. Super important. This action or inaction that's regulated or in accordance with a particular system of governance. Ultimately, we need Scrum teams to be systematic and disciplined. The most successful Scrum teams are ones where they are very disciplined. They write the success criteria on the card. They focus very clearly on the outcomes. They meet daily and are very transparent about what occurred yesterday and what they plan to do today. Discipline happens throughout the Scrum lifecycle, and the context that lifecycle lives in. Done is really done. WIP limits are enforced. We don't have everything in the middle of the board until the day before sprint review. Improvement happens every sprint. Can we promise to find one thing that we can improve? Daily Scrum is at the same time. Cards describe outcomes. Work comes from backlogs. I am sure that you can look at the list of things that are causing you grief today inside your teams and find some of them are to do with discipline. Because the dirty truth about agility is that we rely on people, empowered people, which means we have to trust them, not control them, which means we have to frequently inspect their work to create transparency. It means that we have to have a clear and simple enactable process around things like sprint goals, definition of done, PBIs for success criteria. Everyone is responsible. The system does not protect them. We protect ourselves by a disciplined approach. The next one is around outcomes. We're seeing this massively, that focusing on adding value would really help. That we live in a world where outcomes are not successful. I don't mean to be rude, but the majority of the work you do, only a third of it adds value, according to this study. I don't know what work you're doing. Some of you are saying, well, actually, I wish it was a third. And some of you say a lot more. Obviously, we need to focus on that. We need to focus on an outcome, which is basically a state experienced by the user of the product and an end goal. That means we need to start thinking more clearly about customers. Now, you saw that we added Professional Scrum with UX, working with our friends Jeff and Josh from the Lean UX community, bringing that content into Scrum to make it more Professional Scrum, to make it more customer-centric. The idea of personas, the idea of outcome satisfaction gaps, the idea of measuring the semantic distance between the outcomes to the success of it. Putting in alongside your Scrum board, putting on the board customers and the mission and what we're trying to achieve, and aligning our teams to customers and outcomes in the context of a business process or value flow that they're in. That becomes super important. We don't just believe this. Organizations like Gartner do as well. They see design thinking, lean startup and Scrum merging together into something. Now, they believe it's this kind of model. I think it's more like this. Ultimately, every sprint, we do a little bit of design thinking, a little bit of lean startup, a little bit of Scrum. Some sprints, we do a lot of those things. Some sprints, we do a little of those things, but we're always trying to validate hypothesis. We're always trying to understand where our product feature and our product is in terms of the lean life cycle. And obviously we use Scrum to explore this using a plan, sense, and respond model. It's basically an empirical approach to delivering value. I believe that's going to become more front and center to everything. The last bit on this sort of professionalism is around community. So I get often invited to organizations to talk about scaling, right? Let's talk about scaling. And everybody believes that it's some magical system. You know, it's less, it's safe, it's Nexus, and he even wrote a book on that. It's this, it's that, you know, it's the Spotify model. All of those things have merit. All of them have value, but ultimately the way you scale is through people. You built in a place that supports that. Now, obviously, Spotify made this sort of kind of famous. They created this concept where you have teams aligned to delivering value, and then they have a support network, the chapter and guild, that provides you with the professional development and skills development, which is really, really important. Thinking about that very clearly and making skills development and community a first-class citizen in your organization is the next element to all of this. And the reason why I think that's so important is I think the only way that we learn as an individual is by helping other people learn. I also think that the only way I learn is by talking to people that have done it before. So it's about helping others and getting better. So now, I know this is a roller coaster ride, right? I've gone through lots of things. I've talked about empiricism, self-organization, continuous improvement. I've wrapped that with professionalism, which has a focus on values, outcomes, discipline, and that important element of community. The last thing, I just want to add one thing, and I know I'm at the edge of my time box. Ooh, so I'm the agile police will come and get me, so I don't want that. So there's one more thing. If we're going to do this, we need measurement. An empirical approach cannot be successful unless you can actually see the outcomes of that. So we believe, that should be a build, obviously is not. Oh, here it is. We believe that measures, that product owners and organizations are measured by value. And you need to start thinking about value differently and introducing that to your mix, and then continue making that transparent. Now, we have something called EBM, evidence-based management, which is a value model, but you don't have to use that necessarily. Maybe you could use some other mechanisms. However, ultimately, you need the outcomes to really drive this disciplined approach. Because if you do that, then you end up with something that looks a bit like this. And you end up with an organization and a set of teams and a set of individuals that are agile and able to respond to this very complex world that we live in. Whoa. I'm sorry for the translators that are on the phone, on the line. I know I sped up quite a lot because I know how much I wanted to share with you, but I believe this is the future of Scrum. And hopefully this has been a little bit interesting. Some of those ideas, we'll share the slide deck with you, which has got some references in which you can take advantage of. And I guess we've got like 5 minutes of questions, 4 minutes of questions. Hello.
Hi, Dave.
Aha, there we go. And is there any questions? Hopefully that was okay.
Thank you very much for your for sharing your ideas. It's very interesting to know your vision for what's coming up. And yes, sure, I have some questions, and I would like to invite who is watching us to put your questions in the chat here or here. And first of all, I would like to ask you what do you consider an interesting balance between empirical process, that is what we always are running when we have Scrum, with best practices that are solutions solutions that already worked for in the past. How do you feel what do you consider that is a good balance between these two?
That's a really interesting question. So, and I think what you end up doing, is you end up using, and gosh, I've really not thought of that question before. So I appreciate you asking a really hard question first. I think, so let's use an example. Let's not be abstract in what's the best practice versus, empiricism, which doesn't say there's any best practices, blah, blah, blah. So let's think of a very practical thing. So delivering software into production if it's a software example, is a series of best practices. We've done it like a million times before. Now, there are situations where that does not work. So you continuously run those best practices to the best of your ability until something stops working. Then you evaluate that and you change it accordingly. So what I believe is it's like Scrum is not a release process. It's really a planning process based on the unknown. So what I tend to encourage is we try best practices in an empirical way. If they work, then they just become the norm of the system that we're working. The empiricism really focuses on the outcomes, because we made, great example in banking, we assume that customers use systems the way we've always designed them to use it. However, so when we deliver stuff, we assume that, oh, we always have to do it like this. This is the order we always do it. However, customers have changed, situations have changed, and we need to continuously monitor and try different things around that. So we need to always be challenging best practices in an empirical way. The best practice gives us the ability to do something rapidly. The empiricism gives us the ability to think about it in terms of the outcomes and measure the success of it, and then evaluate whether this still holds true in this current age. Planning is a great example at the moment. We plan every year, and COVID's changed all that. So we have to maybe we start planning in a similar way, but we challenge it continuously. So I guess I say take advantage of the best practices, but put them in the context of an empirical process to evaluate their success. I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Sure, certainly. I started with this question because I know that people always are looking for a already new solution for solutions that always work for every situation. And we know that the reality is changing every day, and we need the empirical process to find new solutions and design thinking, and we have approaches that are more compatible with the world we live now.
And there's an interesting sort of like orthogonal thought to this. Is the problem, one of the biggest problems we have is we have very little organizational slack in our systems. The industrial paradigm removes all time to think and focuses it on all work time, got to be getting, putting that widget in that hole. One thing that empiricism introduces to us is it effectively puts time to evaluate. Scrum does it through sprint review and retro, right? And then the daily really is ultimately oh my God, look what happened, But so having some time to actually look at the results, see how successful you are, and challenge some of those status quo things is super important. And I know a lot of managers after the first 4 or 5 sprints go, do we really need a retro? Aren't we just doing it now? Do we really need all this sprint review? We know what the stakeholders want. And I would argue not to do that. Now, I would argue to use different techniques to expose the sort of like the stakeholders and to the team to different ways of thinking so that you get value out of the retro and the sprint review. But that they actually do work. And really what they are is this little moment where you can step back and go, how did that go? And you do it in the case of sprint review with stakeholders that actually have a different diverse perspective from you. So I encourage you to do that. Sorry, I didn't mean to sort of riff on but I think it's super important.
Yeah. Thank you very much for sharing this vision. And we are running out of time, but I would like to, we could stay much more here, but I would like to ask one more thing. Could you give a final message to us as a tip or any advice you would like to share with people who would like to improve their skills or their process or their team? I don't know.
Yes, I think it's all about outcomes. I wasn't a big fan of all of this way of thinking. And I sat down with Jeff and Josh and went through their lean UX. And I realized that I was such a control work for, I was still very much industrial, even though I pretended not to be. And so I reframed my backlog over that next week to really think about the customer and the outcomes. By thinking about the customer and the outcomes, it empowered the team to do the right thing, to build the right solution based on the constraints, obviously, to do things that I hadn't even thought were possible. Instead of telling them, we need to do a survey here, I focused on, hey, I'd like to learn why customers bought this product, for instance. And interestingly, we didn't do a survey. We captured information in stream. We did interviews. We did all sorts of other things. And it really, that's an example. And it challenged my way of thinking about how I work with teams as a product owner and as a leader by focusing on outcomes. So if I could do one thing, I would realign everything to outcomes and customers.
Yeah. Dave, thank you very much. Thank you
You're
very
very
much.
welcome. And have a fantastic day. Have a fantastic event. Some of you are at the end of your day, some of you are at the start. It's very confusing, isn't it? Thank you for inviting me. And if you need anything, you know, David J. West or Dave.West at Scrum.org, I'm here to help. I love talking about this stuff, maybe too much, as you can hear. And good luck and Scrum on.
Thank you very much. See you soon.
Bye-bye. Ciao.